Quote, "No, it's not. It's never too late. Ever." Joining our conversation, MSNBC national security analyst Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI assistant director for counterintelligence. Matt Miller is still with us. Frank, when you start to read the text, it all, one, makes a whole lot more sense, and two, sounds clearly premeditated.
Indeed, that's why we're seeing charges of conspiracy. There's a couple of interesting things that are noteworthy about this decision to not permit bail and to hold these guys in custody. And that is, first, interestingly, for anyone who claims that this judge might be politically oriented in his decision-making, understand that this was a judge that was appointed by former President Trump. Secondly, this judge had to basically differ with lower court or other federal court judges who had previously been inclined to permit bail pending trial because he was presented with new evidence. What's the new evidence? The evidence is not just that these guys present a clear and present danger if they were to be let out and have no intention of stopping the kind of violence that they were engaged in, but also that there's a growing case here. The prosecutors presented new evidence. And Nicole, the people I'm speaking to who are in a position to know about where these investigations are headed are using phrases with me like, "You haven't seen anything yet. There's more coming." And what they're referring to when I ask them is two things: the number of people that are about to be charged. As you said, it's now been conceded that it will be at least 500. But they're also referring to the caliber and magnitude of the cases. You're going to see more conspiracy. You're going to see people called out as leaders. Don't be surprised if you see this kind of cross-referencing of Proud Boys and Oath Keepers in coordination with each other, and maybe even attempts to take both of those organizations down through an enterprise theory of prosecution.
I'm going to need you to say more about that, but also help us understand what this looks like behind the scenes. Is it like a Carrie Mathison style whiteboard with faces and names and dots and lines? Is it further questioning and looking for plea deals of people who've already been charged? Is it syncing together their actions and looking at their texts? What does it look like behind the scenes?
This investigation is being tightly coordinated out of FBI headquarters and Department of Justice headquarters. The field is still feverishly working. I was surprised to hear that. I thought maybe things had calmed down at the field level, but you talk to people in various far-flung field offices, they are still on it night and day, still identifying people and still looking for these conspiracy charges, these almost RICO-type racketeering organizational charges. And yes, they're working to flip people upwards and flip people out to talk about the role of political leaders and advisors.
You know, Matt, you know the inner workings of the Justice Department. Just speak to how Merrick Garland, with his history now pretty well known, prosecuting Oklahoma City, and Lisa Monaco, with a lot of knowledge and expertise on the extremism front. What do you think the tone is from the top about sort of pursuing these investigations that led to this nearly unprecedented attack on the U.S. Capitol?
I suspect that the direction from both of them is the Justice Department has no higher priority right now than bringing everyone to justice who was responsible for this attack. I worked with Lisa Monaco at the Justice Department. She comes from a background at the FBI, helped Bob Mueller kind of restructure the FBI to take on international terrorism after 9/11. And I suspect she, along with Merrick Garland, is thinking now not just about how do we bring this case, but how do we look at this type of activity across the board and take on domestic extremism, which clearly is on the rise and shows no sign of abating anytime soon. So I think they're kind of a twofold effort. One, to tell the investigators and prosecutors, bring cases with the most serious charges you can justify and bring them as quickly as you can. And two, let's figure out how we address this from both a law enforcement perspective and a policy perspective going forward.
And Matt, what do you think the sort of guidance is on following these associations with elected officials wherever they may lead? There's been some reporting about Roger Stone's associations with some militia members. He used them as security. I mention all the time the New York Times reporting about associations between about a half a dozen House Republicans and some of these groups in the form of appearances. Do you think those ties are under scrutiny?
I suspect they are being cautiously aggressive, which sounds like an oxymoron. Look, I think that the direction they will give to people is, let's follow every lead wherever it goes, and let's not give a pass to anyone just because they're in elected office. But we also have to be careful that we're not overly scrutinizing someone because they're in elected office. They shouldn't get any special treatment, but they also shouldn't get any worse treatment from the Justice Department. So I think they will want to be careful that no one out in the field takes something too far. You can see people in the same way I'll just say you will see people sometimes pursue elected officials because they have animus against them. And so I think they will be very careful to make sure that if anyone pursues a lead against an elected official or their staff or their advisors, it's because the evidence justifies that. And they'll want to have all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed before they do so.
Frank, I wonder if you can just speak to the ongoing threat that it sounds like was the determinative factor in jailing this one member of the Proud Boys. What is your sense of the FBI's belief about the ongoing threat from domestic violent extremists who still believe Donald Trump's big lie?
I can tell you that with regard to joint terrorism task forces across the country in every state, sometimes multiple task forces in every state, it's an all hands on deck situation. They're prepared to surge resources as necessary. And folks who have been the best athletes, the best players against international terrorism on a particular task force or squad are often being flipped over to domestic terrorism to apply those very same skill sets. That's because they believe the threat continues, and they believe that that kind of motivation, the inspiration, is still there, not only in the form of the former president, but in the form of members of Congress who just refuse to back away from the big lie, from the notion that things were not that bad on January 6th. That inspiration is still there. It's not abating. And until, as Matt referred to, until there's kind of a whole of government, whole of society approach to counter extremism, this is not just going to get resolved with the law enforcement side of things.
Well, and Matt, I asked because the big lie is fueling something we talk about separately, and maybe we should stop doing that. The big lie is fueling voter suppression legislation in 47 states. I mean, what is the work that needs to be done across both parties and everyone in public life to beat back the big lie if it's behind a threat to the homeland and legislation that is rooted in something that isn't even true?
Well, look, I think everyone needs to be very clear in their communications about exactly what's happened and what's true and what's not. But we also have to be clear-eyed about the fact that there are people, on the Republican side of the aisle who are acting in bad faith or are going to continue to lie because it's in their interest to do so. And the only way to combat that lie, unfortunately, is not just with the truth, but it's with policy changes. The one we talked about in an earlier segment, to pass voting, to pass a voting reform legislation to make it impossible for people to perpetuate this lie and turn it into actual, restrictive rules that make it harder for people to vote. Ultimately, you would like to think that the truth is going to win out, but that's not always the case anymore. You're going to have to beat the truth, or you're going to have to beat a lie, not just with the truth, but with actual changes in how the government behaves.
Frank Figliuzzi, Matt Miller, an incredibly important conversation. I'm grateful to both of you for having it with us on this Friday.